about the discrediting of the elections? Because I think that there's a really hard push of that. Biden referred to it as a pantomime election, which harkens back to Ronald Reagan's response to the 1984 election. Katie's helpfully pantomime.
All right, I'm doing a pantomime.
But
The
That's really
2000, the
Ben, I
2000
would like
presidential
to
election.
pantomime your answer to this
Yeah,
question.
please, yeah.
No, I just want to say one comment. The 2000 election and the presidential election in the U.S. was definitely not a pantomime. Bush won freely and fairly.
Right.
Yeah, seriously, it's like, well, you don't even have to go that far back. I mean, we're in President Manchin's administration right now, and it's like the idea that the United States should be lecturing anybody else about democracy is crazy. But he called it a pantomime election, harkening back to Reagan in '84, referring to the election as a sham election. Um, the OAS is releasing reports.
The Organization of American States.
Yes, is releasing a report basically calling for the election to be annulled, and much has been made. That's I think the number they're saying is 7 candidates for president or potential candidates for president have been arrested. Now, I went and I just looked at this list of the potential candidates who've been arrested, and the name Chamorro came up, I think, more than once. And some of the biographies of these people seemed quite interesting. Could you talk about who makes up the opposition to this Sandinista government, who some of these potential presidential candidates were?
Let me just give a little bit of a timeline first to these statements that you're talking about. So this whole year, we've heard various statements and literally just threats and, just very coercive statements towards Nicaragua, Nicaraguan authorities, and even directing statements towards the Nicaraguan people, trying to scare them away from voting their choice here at the polls. So the entire year, we've heard from the OAS, we heard from the State Department, we heard from Blinken, and of course, the far right congressmen that make up, the U.S. legislature. And these people have been, calling, they've been saying that there's no transparency. They have been making statements about, the way in which the elections here have been organized. They have accused the Nicaraguan government of all sorts of things, including, like you said, locking up political opponents and not allowing free press and sticking to that sort of a script that we've seen over and over again in every country that they don't like, that's governed, by a leftist government all across Latin America, but most recently in Venezuela, permanently in Cuba, and, obviously in Bolivia. And so, they've had a lot to say, and they've been holding regular Zoom conferences. They've been holding Zoom conferences kind of as breakout meetings as part of the Organization of American States, even attached to the UN General Assembly. They've had these sorts of meetings, and these are by no means neutral because they're actually inviting the people Ben is about to describe, which is, various people who are part of the right-wing press here in Nicaragua, and also those right-wing politicians and their associates. So, they're using these international bodies, the OAS and the UN, to try to discuss Nicaragua without actually speaking with anyone who forms part of the Nicaraguan government here, but they're actually going directly to bring in the voices of the opposition. And so this is, collusion and meddling, if nothing else, because at these meetings, and a lot of these meetings have been quite, accessible on Zoom. Of course, this is still like in the framework of COVID. So some of them are partially in person, some are online, but it's, they're inviting people like these far right congressmen in the US, these far right political actors here in Nicaragua, and also, the Human Rights Watch, Jose Vivanco, is that his name? And these sorts of people from, the NGO sector and from, this fake human rights industry. And so all of these people are coming together with people who represent Almagro, and they're plotting all year round up until the very, week before the elections. Then, we hear a statement from Canada a few days before the elections. And on the weekend itself, on Saturday and Sunday, we hear almost nothing. It's dead silence. And of course, the whole of the U.S. State is watching, the U.S. government is watching what's taking place here in Nicaragua and saying absolutely nothing. And so obviously we know that we're waiting for them to drop something on Sunday night. Just as the polls are closing here, we get those statements from Biden, which call it, a sham election, which call it a pantomime. Then we have on Monday, Blinken released his statement, as well as Ned Price from the State Department, is disseminating that. And then today, Luis Almagro, tweets out the link to the 17-page sham report in which, they just recycle all of the same tactics that we've seen used against all of their official enemy governments. And, they call for the annulment of these elections. They call for new elections. They want supposed guarantees and all of these conditions that meet, that meet the conditions of the U.S. State Department, not the conditions of, the Nicaraguan people or any sort of electoral authority here, or any of the institutions here. But, they're calling it the international community. Again and again, they say international community, but they're really just talking about the United States government.
Camila, just to join in with what you're saying, because I think it's really important, especially for younger viewers. This happening in Nicaragua is, I think, not entirely unique. I mean, I think if the United States said the same thing to Palestinians or to Iraqis or to Afghanis, it would be similar. But in 1990, the Sandinistas lost the election because the United States was very clear that they had been funding death squads for 10 years. And if the election didn't go their way, the death squads would continue. And so this...
Well, and sorry to cut you off, Sam, but there was also an economic blockade, which is another crucial detail that doesn't get talked about. There was an economic blockade of Nicaragua in the 80s, which caused hyperinflation, a shortage of goods, and long lines, the same kind of things we see in Venezuela under the U.S. blockade. It's a dual-pronged strategy. So fund the terror death squads and blockade the country until they vote the government out.
But I just think that there's a way where, especially for people who weren't around for the 80s or were not politically active in the 80s.
Yeah, didn't have leftist parents.
This kind of empty rhetoric or this facile rhetoric about we support democracy, we support fair elections, we hope that it turns out the right way. It may sound like, they have the best of intentions, but Blinken and Biden have been around for a very long time, and they know exactly what this election better turn out the right way. It's going to sound like to the people of Nicaragua who suffered under the Contras for 10 years. And I think, to follow up with Ben, some of these candidates who were arrested, a lot has been made that people were under house arrest, but nothing has been mentioned about the fact that some of the people arrested are ex-Contras.
Yeah, and just to lightly correct you, not to criticize you, Sam, but they were not candidates. I know. This is how they call gray propaganda, right? Nothing to do with the gray zone.
From the gray zone, yeah.
Gray propaganda is that's exactly how the corporate media often works. Is that it's not entirely wrong, but there's key elements that are wrong in it, but it's peppered in with things that are true.
Right.
No candidates were arrested. Now, in Spanish, they keep calling them precandidatos, which in the U.S., the best term would be aspiring presidential candidate. We often hear that. But as I also joke, I often point out, but seriously, okay, I am a candidate for the U.S. president. It doesn't mean anything. All it means is that someone was arrested for violating the laws. I'll talk about in a second. Someone was arrested for plotting a violent coup.
Really going to help you, Ben.
I was going to say, yeah. Now that you've been on this show, yeah.
So
in 2018,
the other context we need to know, aside from the 80s, which Sam pointed out, which is really important, that the terror war in which the CIA armed and trained these fascist death squads, one of the main leaders of the Contras quit from the Chamorro oligarchy. The Chamorro family are the elite, rich, dynasty that dominated Nicaragua up until the Somoza dictatorship backed by the U.S. And in the history of Nicaragua, which is 150 years old as a modern nation state, there have been 7 different presidents from the Chamorro family. They're the descendants of the Spanish colonialists who became politicians as the kind of mestizo elite. And anyway, the point is that the Chamorros were deeply involved not only in the Contras in the 1980s, and one of the Contra leaders, one of the Chamorros, published an article in the New York Times admitting that the most effective weapon of the Contras is terrorism, as he said. And he famously wrote that the Contras burn down hospitals and schools faster than the Sandinistas can build them. Well, fast forward, and the Chamorros were central, the same oligarchic family, were central in a 2018 coup attempt, a very violent coup attempt in Nicaragua that outside of the country was presented as the Ortega regime violently cracking down on activists. That's not at all what happened. It was a violent coup attempt in which, yes, unfortunately, there were deaths on both sides. But if you look at the actual numbers, the majority of the people killed, which the estimates vary, but the most likely estimate is over 300 people. Slightly over half of them were either Sandinistas or police from the government. So, and roughly less than a third of the people killed were the so-called protesters, who actually in many cases were armed and very violent, like in Venezuela with the guarimbas in 2017. So we have to understand not just the 80s, which is important context, but even the most recent history of 2017 with the violent coup attempt in Venezuela with the so-called guarimbas, the violent barricades, in which they set Black Venezuelans, Afro-Venezuelans on fire because they assumed that they were all Chavistas. There's videos of these largely light-skinned, white, right-wing fascists, frankly, who would have totally been down with Pinochet in the 70s, of them lighting Afro-Venezuelans on fire. There's video and photos of this. And then the next year, in 2018, with the violent coup attempt here in Nicaragua, with the so-called tranques, the only difference between the coup attempt here, the year after in Venezuela, was that in Venezuela, they were called guarimbas. Here, they were called tranques, but it was the same playbook. And then finally, let's not forget the coup in 2019 in Bolivia. Each year, there was a coup attempt. Unfortunately, in Bolivia, the coup failed because Evo didn't control the military. And I want to point out, one other quick note here.
You mean the coup failed? You said the coup failed.
Sorry, the coup succeeded in Bolivia, but it failed in Venezuela and Nicaragua. Thank you for that correction. It succeeded in Bolivia, and I want to point out really quickly, I'll end on this note really quickly, that in 2019, don't forget that there were a lot of people, unfortunately, even on the left, who pushed this narrative that Evo had become a dictator because he was pursuing his fourth term, which is true. I mean, it was his fourth consecutive term. And which term is this for Ortega? It's his fourth term. Now, people could say that they're supposedly authoritarian, but the reality is that these are very popular leaders in countries that have a history of a lot of instability, and they're trying to maintain stability. And if you think about it in a lot of ways, you can say that term limits are whatever, but the reality is in some ways, term limits can be seen as undemocratic when you have a leader who's extremely popular, like Evo Morales was, and like Ortega is. And think about liberals talking about Obama. A lot of liberals would love to have Obama.